Thank you for the invitation to speak this afternoon, and hello to everybody online and thank you for joining to hear this presentation. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the work that we do in FaceLab, which is our research group based in Liverpool. And the research focuses around human face recognition. So it's around the psychology of face identification, and it's related to the casework that we do out of the lab. But just to give you a little bit of a brief background, there are currently 9 of us in FaceLab. That changes quite regularly. We get quite a lot of visiting research staff. Professor Caroline Wilkinson is our director, and we were formed back in 2014, so about 10 years old now. And within the research group, we are very much a multidisciplinary team. So we have people from art backgrounds, illustration, curatorial practice, archaeology, forensic anthropology. So lots of variety in our backgrounds. And we all contribute to the 2 kind of main pathways out of FaceLab. So one is research, which is obvious, and the other one is our practice, our professional services that we provide. And it's that I'm going to be talking a little bit about today. So as the name suggests, we do everything to do with faces, and the services that we offer are mainly around depicting faces for identification or for illustration of archaeological and historical figures. But we do some other things like image analysis or facial image analysis, some CGI things, some research around ethics and bias in decision making with regards to faces. And we also collaborate with a lot of different people and different departments on multidisciplinary research and practice projects. One of our main outputs, our professional practice outputs from the lab, is craniofacial reconstruction or approximation, which is where you have the skeletal or partially skeletonized remains of somebody, and we take the skull data and we produce a face of what the person was most likely to have looked like during life. And there's different ways that we get given that data. Sometimes we have to go and scan the skull ourselves. That's that top image on the right. Sometimes we're given a scan already, or sometimes we're given in vivo data, so something like CT, where we would then extract the skull model out of that. That's then taken into our digital reconstruction software that we use, which is Freeform. 3D Systems Freeform, and that comes with this little weird pen device, which you can see on the bottom right hand corner here. And it's a haptic feedback device, so we can feel what's on the screen. I think this is used by quite a lot of approximation practitioners now, and it allows us to virtually sculpt to reconstruct the face in phases. So we'll add muscles, we add average tissue depth pegs, so that's kind of the thickness around the contours of the face, and then we can add facial features and skin. All of the process to make the shape of the face is based on anatomical standards that's from research where people have investigated the relationship between the skull and the soft tissues of the face, and that's primarily what the shape is based on. And this particular piece of software gives us a really nice shape model, but it doesn't give us all of that kind of textural elements, so the skin color, the hair, the kind of pigmentation, freckles, marks, etc. That has to be done in a separate piece of software. The example that you're seeing on the screen now is using Photoshop, so this is a 2D output. And this is actually of St. Nicholas. My colleague Mark Ruffley produced this. I thought St. Nicholas was quite appropriate given that we're in December now. And it's so this is another example of the translation from the skull and the underlying musculature towards the reconstructed shape. In terms of the application of those particular reconstructions, we have two main threads that we separate it into. One is forensics. So this is where the primary aim of the reconstruction is to try and identify somebody that is unidentified. So we'll often get contacted by law enforcement that have some remains, they have a skull and they don't know who it is. They've exhausted all other methods of identification. They'll come to us and say, can you produce a likeness of what this person would have looked like in life? That then gets sent out via the police through the media in the hope that somebody from the general public will recognize that reconstruction or note that it looks similar to somebody they know that is missing or hasn't been seen. So that's the kind of basis for the forensic side of things. On the screen, you can see a few examples of some of our forensic casework that we've done over the years. Because the primary focus is on identification, we focus on keeping the texturing, so what I was talking about earlier, the skin and hair, etc., as average as possible, because the skull isn't going to tell us exactly what somebody's skin or hairstyle was like. So we'll use image modification techniques to help to make that image more ambiguous. So things like blurring, a little bit of noise, cropping the image, and making things more or less in focus. Those are some of the things that we do with our forensic casework. We also highlight certain things that might make that person more identifiable. For example, if they've got unusual teeth, you can see in that middle image, there's a very small thumbnail of the teeth to help with recognition. And just on a slight tangent, but we've got an ongoing project at the moment, a European funded project on migrant disaster victim identification. And some of these processes around facial reconstruction and depiction are being adopted in that framework to try and identify deceased migrants. If you're interested, if you Google, there's a code there, CA22106, if you want to have a look. On the flip side, we have the archaeological and historical application of our reconstructions. These are for figures from the past, and normally the client is somebody like a museum curator that has a set of archaeological remains and they want to find a way to engage with the audience and bring that particular figure to life. And you can see that these final depictions look quite different from the forensic ones. They're often based on historical records. Maybe there's portraiture, written documents. Sometimes we get phenotypic DNA that helps us to make some decisions around hair color and eye color, for example. On the left, you've got Saint Nick again. In the middle is a Norwegian Mesolithic man. And then on the right is our most recent output, which is King Richard III, or the King under the car park, where this was a 4D animation of the reconstruction. So we'd use another program called MetaHuman to add animation. So he spoke a piece of writing from that period and it had all the expression, etc. If you want to have a look, that is available on our FaceLab webpage. So that's just a little bit of a background around facial reconstruction. The reason I mention it is because this presentation is looking at the challenges involved in that texturing process. So how do we get from the left-hand image to the right-hand image? This is the same individual. The left is just the shape only that comes out of freeform, and the right is the textured version. Before we delve into that, I will just give you a brief overview of the different outputs that we produce from FaceLab. I know other practitioners do some other things, but this is our workflow. So on the top right, you can see our 2D outputs basically take a screenshot of the reconstruction and take it into image editing software. We use Adobe Photoshop, and then textures are added. On the bottom left, you will see a 3D digital version. So this is where we take the shape only model from Freeform and take it into softwares that have some more refined tools for adding things like pores, wrinkles, marks, etc. We use primarily ZBrush, and we also use Maya sometimes, so we're kind of moving away from that. And those programs also offer you the opportunity to add pigmentation, so color, things like that. The yellow bar is our 3D movie output. We used to do this using Maya, where we would take the 3D model with the skin textures, etc., and then we would rotate them in Maya with a virtual lighting scene and render that out as a video. More recently, like with Richard III, we are using a couple of other applications. So MetaHuman, I'll talk about this a little bit later as well, and Unreal Engine, which is similar to Maya, and then we'll render out a 3D movie, and that could be just a rigid animation, so a rotation of the head, or it could include dynamic animation, so movement of the face itself. Then lastly is our 3D physical print and paint output. The museums really like this particular output. It's a nice thing to have on display there, where the 3D model is sent to the 3D printer, and then we paint it manually and we add eyebrows, eyelashes, wigs, etc. If you ever come to the lab, there are lots of very strange things in the lab that we have to buy. So we do a lot of wig shopping, eyeball shopping, etc., in order to produce that kind of output. But as I mentioned, there are some challenges with this. So within all of those digital outputs, our workflow consists of some hand painted texture, where we will take paintbrushes and things like that and actually manually paint skin from scratch. And we use that in combination with photographic donors. So these are photographs of real people from various databases. And we will sample sections from those faces that we've looked for in terms of matching the morphology of the face we're reconstructing, and we will copy and paste them into whatever program we're using and then adjust them to fit the face. So it's a combination of those two things, really, manual painting and photographic donors, and it's the photographic donor part that I want you to focus on. When we're choosing donors, we need to make sure that all of them, because we use more than just one, have consistent lighting, resolution, texture quality, etc. So that actually takes up quite a lot of time, probably more time than actually doing the reconstruction itself. And all of those different textures are composited to form these finished facial depictions. This is just a close-up of the type of thing that we might do in Photoshop. So when we bring a texture donor in, we'll maneuver and adjust them to fit the morphology of the facial reconstruction that we're working on. In this case, this is the puppet walk tool that allows you to maneuver various parts of the texture sample. And then this is a video just showing you kind of some of the layers that we might have in a 2D output. You can see there's quite a lot. It depends on the practitioner how many layers they have. I use loads, which really annoys Caroline, my boss, but and it takes me quite a long time, but that's just the way I work. So that's the kind of setup that we use in the lab. So that's for 2D. We also use those photographic donors in our 3D work, where we use what's called the spotlight function in ZBrush. I don't know if anybody's used that here, and that allows you to project part of the texture onto your 3D model. So we use that to help us with mapping out wrinkle patterns, for example, or areas of pigmentation, and that's in combination with some hand painting. So that's the workflow. Think about the fact that we're using photographic donors, and this example I'm going to show you now is the reason why we've now done some research on how we can use photographic donors. So I'm going to go through the research, but first of all, I just want to show you this example. And I want to caveat this in that I am not criticizing the person that did this work, because the knowledge around recognition of donors was not fully understood back then. Actually, it's not completely understood, but it's a good example of what can happen. So this is an age progression of Osama bin Laden. So on the left, you have a photograph, the last known photograph of Osama bin Laden from 1998 that the FBI had access to. In 2008, he had been on the run for 10 years or so. And so the FBI wanted to know what he would look like then. And they asked an FBI forensic artist to produce an age progression. And that's the image in the middle. The image on the right is the photographic donor. So I don't know the exact techniques that this artist used, but it looks like some form of compositing similar to what we use in our facial depiction work. So that's why I'm showing it as an example. But the image on the right, I think you can quite clearly see that the hair has been copied and pasted across and slightly narrowed, but other than that, there's not been any transformation. The crease on the forehead and the majority of the forehead is the same. There's some parts around the jawline and some textures on the nose, etc., that have also been taken. So quite a lot of the image on the right has been used in the age progression. Second is that when you're working or looking for texture donors, as I mentioned earlier, you're going to choose donors that look similar to the face that you're working on, because you need consistency of contrast and tone, etc. So the image on the right has similar kind of contrast patterns to the image on the left, and that's probably why it's been sampled. It's age appropriate, etc. So it's a good donor to use, but this particular artist has used quite a lot of that donor image. What they didn't realize was that, so they'd found this image online. I should say that first. So the image on the right, they'd found online. Normally they work from internal databases of images that they have, but there wasn't anything suitable. So this artist looked online and found the image on the right. What they didn't realize was this is a well-known person. So when the age progression went out to the public globally, including Spain, they didn't realize, or the artist didn't realize, that that image on the right is actually of a famous Spanish politician. That Spanish politician, presumably not well known within the FBI or within the US, but obviously very well known in Spain. So when it was sent out to the public, people in Spain, as well as this individual, recognized it as looking like him, and that when they compared it, they could see that the data had been taken from this Spanish politician. Then the name of the politician, I'm going to butcher it, but it's something like Jasper Tamares. I am on Duolingo. I am learning Spanish, but I haven't quite got there yet. So I'm sure some people in the Spanish audience will be cringing at my pronunciation. But you can actually find this information online if you Google the age progression of Osama bin Laden. So obviously, this politician was incredibly unhappy that their image had been used to age progress the image of a known terrorist. And subsequently went on, I believe, to sue the FBI for this. I don't know the outcome, it was all behind closed doors, but there was a settlement of some kind. So because of this particular case, it raises the question on using photographic donors within facial depiction and compositing work. So we wanted to better understand this process. For our particular workflow, we can't use de-identification techniques. So if we take a face image, we can't de-identify it and then use it. because we need the integrity of the anatomy and the texture, etc. So examples of where de-identification has been used really successfully aren't applicable in our situation. I was desperate to show these images because these are by Adam Harvey, who's an artist and activist, and they are called like dazzle faces, and they're based on the dazzling technique that they used on U-boats in I think it was World War I, maybe World War II, I'm not sure. And they painted the U-boats so that any enemy surveillance planes flying overhead couldn't actually detect that there was a boat there. Adam Harvey applied this same principle to faces with these kind of block patterns and shapes, so that any automated face recognition surveillance cameras would not detect that there was a face there. So I think that's a really interesting project. So that's one form of de-identification, but we can't use that. And then other typical examples are masking, blurring, pixelization, etc., which are great ways to, you know, they work in some form towards de-identification, but again, they're not applicable in our situation because we need to maintain the anatomy. So what other techniques can we use to de-identify? And what we realized is that actually the process we're already using, this compositing process, could de-identify the faces because we're not using the whole face. But we don't understand, or didn't at the time understand, whether it works, and also whether we could use all features or there's some that we can't use, and also how much of a donor face can we use while still concealing their identity, because we don't want to be in a position where they're identifiable in one of our facial depictions. So we set about doing a study on this. There's already quite a lot of literature around recognition of altered faces. So if you remove a feature, we're still really good at recognizing them. But then there is a saliency hierarchy. So eyes are considered the most important, with the nose kind of the least important. And we also know that we're quite good at recognizing faces from just face parts, so just the eyes, for example. And what there's been research on quite a lot is actually on compositing. So taking the top and bottom halves of two different faces and compositing them, and it's called the composite face illusion. When those two parts are composited together to form a whole face, we can't recognize the two halves independently. We just see it as one new face. So this was all really promising for us in terms of our work. We just need to go down that compositing route and work out what we can and can't do. So we set up a face recognition type task, and we needed a familiar face set. So we used both celebrities and lecturers, and the participants for the lecturer study were their students who had obviously seen them around campus. And then we were interested in altering those faces to see how recognition dropped. And we called this a miss rate. So if they couldn't recognize it after the alteration, that was counted as a miss. So in order to make these composites, we needed to have a counterpart for our familiar target face. And that counterpart needed to be completely unrecognizable or unfamiliar to our participant pool. So we ended up making a whole bunch of unfamiliar, unique composite faces that we could then match with our target face. Now, the reason they were matched is if you take a face that's very different and you take a facial feature and paste it onto Tom Hardy, it's going to look weird. So the faces needed to be similar in terms of contrast and luminance and age appropriate, etc. So this is an example of the counterpart with Tom Hardy. And in terms of the methodology, we just took, to make those counterpart faces, we took textures, featural textures from faces from a database that we could use for this type of research. And that was using Photoshop. So here's an example stimulus. So on the left, we have Tom Hardy, the familiar face. In the middle of his unique composite counterpart face. And on the right is one stimulus condition. So this is where we've taken the hair of the counterpart face and composited it onto Tom Hardy, and that gives you your stimulus on the right-hand side. And we were interested if you change the hair, does that reduce recognition of Tom Hardy? And that was done for 6 different features. There are 1,000,001 different ways that you can composite, and you can separate the face 1,000,001 different ways. The route we went down was feature-based, just because that's the way we work in terms of our methods in the lab. So it made the most sense. But obviously there are lots of ways that you could have done this, but we didn't have time to do all of them. For testing, we then would show that image to the participant pool and ask them if they recognize them. So are you familiar with them? You're familiar, but you can't name them because naming is in a separate part of the brain. So we would still allow people to report that they were familiar. And then familiar, and I can provide a name or description. So if they can't remember the name of the actor, then they could say they were in the film Venom, for example, or Tom Hardy, and that would still count as a familiar recognition and not a miss. We had 2 sections in the testing. So on the left-hand side is the testing stimulus with that set of questions I've just shown. Then those set of questions were shown again in a control section right at the end, but using the original image of the familiar face. And this was designed so that we would only extract the trials where people knew who the person was in the first place. So if they weren't familiar with Tom Hardy, based on their response to the control section, then that whole trial was taken out and not analysed, because we're only interested in familiar here. So our first phase was around looking at this feature saliency hierarchy. And as a baseline, we did one very quick experiment where we just showed isolated features to establish, if our celebrities and lecturer faces were working, and also just to kind of get a little bit of baseline data. So the unique composite was not required in this experiment. And we got results which were very much consistent with existing literature. So the task was quite difficult. You can see that the miss rates are quite high. Miss rate is where they didn't know who the person was based on that stimulus. And eyes had the lowest miss rate, which suggests they're more salient for recognition. There was more information there for them to recognize. And we did get a little bit of difference for the hair between males and females. Miss rates were lower for females. So the next experiment was taking that featural saliency hierarchy, but applying it to a whole face. So this is similar to the example I showed before, where you have your original target, Tom Hardy, your unique composite, and then individual features from the unique composite were copied and pasted onto Tom Hardy. And that was done 6 times. That's one each of those 6 different facial features. So it was only ever one featural change in any stimulus. And when those features were pasted onto Tom Hardy, they were pasted at the appropriate size and position for Tom Hardy's face. That means that the only change was featural. So the configuration or arrangement of the features, the contrast and luminance was kept consistent. It was just a shape change for one feature. And our results were similar, so they're the reverse, sorry, of the first experiment, which is what you expect. But we obviously got the highest miss rate when you change the eyes, because they're the most important. If you change them, that means the miss rates will increase. So we can see that eyes is the most salient for celebrities. We collected some lecturer data as well, and we got slightly different results. The data wasn't quite as good, but it seemed that hair was more important for lecturers. And that might be to do with the environment in which the participants were engaging, or the students were engaging with those lecturers. So it was mostly in lecture room type scenarios where there might be a big distance between where the student was sat and the lecturer is at the front of the room. Hair becomes important then because it's quite a big feature. But crucially, you can see that the overall average mean miss rate across all conditions is quite low. So changing one feature isn't really enough. And I just want to say before we move on to the next experiment that there was some debate around the way that we would make these composites. So do you take the unknown face and take Tom Hardy's features and composite them, or do you do the reverse? And we decided to do the reverse just because the other way was probably a bit too easy. So going on to the last experiment, this was the real kind of crux of the study, if you like. This is where we find out what we hopefully can do in terms of using photographic donors. And this was based on how much of the face needs to be replaced. And the opposite of that in the work that we do is how much can we use, right? So on the left, again, we have our pairing of Tom Hardy and the unique composite. But this time, the first condition replaced one feature. The second condition added a replacement of another feature. So eyes and eyebrows in this case. The third condition is eyes, eyebrows plus nose, and so forth. So we were incrementally adding the features from the unique composite. And this was to see at what point in that replacement does it shift from real data, Tom Hardy, to synthetic data, our unique composite. And that criterion point was what we were interested in. And you can see, so right at the end where all features have been replaced, the only thing remaining of Tom Hardy there is the contrast pattern again and his configuration. The order of replacement was based on some of those saliency results from the first two experiments, and the starting point of that order was rotated so that we weren't ever always replacing eyes as the first condition. It would rotate. And our results were quite interesting. I'm only showing the celebrity data because the lecturer data wasn't great. We didn't quite have enough to use. So I'm just focusing on the celebrity. This is a homogeneous subset graph. So on the left, we have the positions. So one is one feature replaced, two, three features, four features, etc. 0 is obviously Tom Hardy, and 7 is the unique composite. And what we're interested in is at what point do you get a shift or a significant shift in miss rates? So it's at between points 2 and 3, you get a significant increase in miss rates. So that suggests that once you have replaced half of the face, things start to drop off quite considerably. Anything before that, the miss rates are a little bit too low, therefore the person is still quite recognizable. And we did see that the more features you add, the more that miss rate increases. So that's quite good in terms of, is it concealing identity? But we did get that nice kind of criterion point that once at least 3 features have been replaced, you're starting to get a drop in recognition. If we think about this in the applied way that we do in the lab, that would mean that you could only ever use less than half the face, so maximum 3 features of the face. So that was quite a nice practical output for our workflow. We did also find that there was a slight problem that the miss rates would be lower when all of those features in that first 3 were from either the top or the bottom of the face. So that suggests that if you're going to use maximum 3 features from a donor, they shouldn't be from the same half of the face. They should be spread across the face. And this is just a summary slide, just showing you those key results. So experiment 2, we've got saliency of eyes and hair. And then in experiment 3, we found that once you've done 3 features, things start to really drop off. So you should only ever use less than 3 features. We got a bit of a strange result when all of the 6 features have been replaced. So that last feature or condition where in experiment 3, where all 6 were replaced. So all that was remaining was the configuration and contrast pattern of Tom Hardy, for example. You would assume you get 0 recognition at that point. However, we didn't. And there's a couple of reasons that we think might explain that. One is that there's just a natural similarity between your unique composite and the target face for obvious reasons, because you need to have a similar contrast pattern. And second, that the configuration of the target was still remaining. So Tom Hardy's configuration was still there. Or in this case, Leonardo DiCaprio's configuration is still there. So you get this natural similarity. And that's a problem because we are looking for those similarities in our donors. So we have to be a bit careful around that. And also the compositing bias as well. So I ended up having to make about 700 composites for all of this. So there was, you know, I think I was kind of probably compositing them in a way that they looked more similar than they should have. So our conclusions from that are that compositing in our workflow does go some way towards concealing the identity of the donors that we're using. However, there are some weird effects. The example I just showed, where once all 6 features are replaced, we're not getting identity concealed 100% of the time. And we can kind of conclude what you can't do. So don't use more than half the face based on experiment 3. And also they should not all come from the same half of the face. But because identity wasn't concealed 100% of the time, we haven't kind of fully answered what you definitely can do. However, our thoughts are that you need to adjust the configuration and adjust the contrast, etc., and that will help. Luckily for us in the lab, we do this already because a donor is never going to be exactly what we require. So we would always adjust the morphology, change the contrast, maybe add some shadows, etc. And that should help to conceal the donor's identity. So future research is to look a little bit more at some of that residual information around configuration and how that's behaving in a compositing context. So that's the research we did around using photographic donors, using real data to make synthetic faces, if you like. But I just wanted to talk a little bit about the future, really, because whilst we use photographic compositing techniques currently and have done for a while, we are looking to adopt new platforms and techniques. And one of those is the MetaHuman Creator. Maybe some people on this call have had a go with this. It's a really, really cool piece of kit. It's based on the browser and it's called MetaHuman Creator, and it allows you to make synthetic faces. And it does this by using a set of preset faces. I was trying to remember how many there are. I think it's around 65 faces that they have that are preset in the platform. And you can blend those faces together, you can adjust the morphology, you can change the texture patterns, etc. So it's really a great way to make synthetic faces, and they look beautiful in rendering software. But they still face a bit of a problem, really, because on their website it says that those presets are based on pre-existing scans of real people. So you're still, even though it's a synthetic face platform, it's still starting with real data, and it's it's proprietary in nature, so we don't know how much of those real people's faces still exist in those presets. We don't know the level of consent. I'm not suggesting there was no consent. They obviously got consent for this, but it does raise that question around what's presented as purely synthetic data is actually probably based on real data. And our kind of idea of our own data and how that presents in synthetic data is kind of evolving a little bit, I think. And I wanted to show GANs faces, obviously generative adversarial networks. They are synthetic in that it's randomly the generator is randomly making a face, but then the discriminator is then comparing it to real face data to determine if it's successful, and that's how you then build this GANs network. So it's still using real data. And then I just wanted to put these in because there's this website that's really cool called Which Face is Real. So one of these faces is a GANs face and the other is a real face. So I just want you to guess which one you think is the real face. I'll give you a few seconds and then I'll reveal. Okay, the image on the left is real, the image on the right is synthetic. And I've got another one for you. Okay, image on the right is real. That one's slightly easier because you can see there's some artifacts from the eyelashes and around here. But they're pretty good and they're getting better as well. But again, they use real data for training. So it still raises that question of, how synthetic are these systems? And for future thoughts, whilst our specific scenario in the lab is around using photographic donors, it is a symptom of a broader question around the use of face data and for creating synthetic data. It's specifically around what's our threshold. So are we concerned if our data is used when it's biometrically identifiable? Is it recognition that we're concerned with? Are we okay with resemblance? So if there's kind of a holistic trace of our face in a synthetic face data, do we mind that? Do we mind if it's that we're recognizable by humans and not by computers, or vice versa, or both? And are people more comfortable with their data being used if it's more abstracted? So for example, with the GANs networks, it's a kind of abstracted data training asset, isn't it? Our threshold kind of is a little bit ambiguous, and I imagine that it's different for different people. In our workflow, we just want to make sure that they're not recognized by people from a perceptual perspective, but there are obviously other aspects to that. And I just wanted to pose the question really of around the use of increased 3D and 4D data, and how you would feel if that was available, in the same way as our images are mined and you can search for them on Google Images, for example. How would you feel if that became 3D or 2D as we go forward? So just some future thoughts really. And also the irony that we're de-identifying faces to help identify faces is not lost on us. But thank you for your time and happy to take any questions.